feel like I should probably introduce you to this. This is Miranda Griffin. She's a member of the Department of Modern and Medieval Languages and Linguistics. I cannot say MMLL for the life of me. I wish they hadn't added that extra L, it's really hard. And a couple of years ago, in the first year of my PhD, I decided to sit in on the medieval French lectures that I had previously sort of taken in undergrad, but I wanted to do it again. Miranda was lecturing. They were honestly the highlight of my PhD so far. She gives such good lectures, says what she's going to do, then does it. Love that. So few lecturers do this. And she kindly agreed to do a Q&A with me about the book and about the world of Bisclavret. And I do have some notes just in case my coding kicks in too much. So if I'm looking at my phone, that's why.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Tricia, thank you. That was fantastic. I've never sat through a lay and listened to it like that and felt like joining in. So that was really fantastic. So Finn, thank you for this fantastic book, which I'm going to brandish because I have an advanced copy. I really enjoyed reading it. I wondered if you could start by telling us why you decided to take this new avenue in your work, because before now in your creative writing you've been writing original stories. So why did you decide to rewrite and adapt in novel form a 12th century Anglo-Norman story about a werewolf?
Well, first of all, I really hate making up my own plots. So this is a great advantage of retelling, right? Yeah, exactly. It's a time-honoured tradition to take an old story, tell it in a new way, in a new language, in a different form, translate it from one style to another. And yeah, it means you don't have to come up with plots. You also don't have to come up with character names half the time. I got away with that in this book by only naming one character, which is the kind of pretentious literary nonsense you don't get in many places. The idea for this book came when I was doing the medieval French paper as an undergrad. So I was in the ASNAC department and I took it as a borrowed paper in second year. Now I actually intermitted halfway through second year and then did all the second year again. So I sort of got double French for two for the price of one. And in the second year that I was doing French, and Blake Gutt was supervising me, and he sent me an essay that the title was "The Lays of Marie de France are essentially queer. Discuss." Which was my first exposure to queer theory, which I actually ended up specialising in for a while, so it had quite a big academic influence on me. Although at the time, it mostly meant I read some really terrible 80s queer theory. I mean, it was not good. But while I was doing that, and I mostly wrote my essay, it was about 4,500 words long, and it got increasingly sarcastic as it continued. It was the best essay I ever wrote. But I was writing about Bisclavret and Guigemard particularly, because I think Guigemard's really productively read through like asexual and aromantic lenses. And then Bisclavret very much is so focused on this homosocial relationship between a man and his lord, and ultimately this relationship serves him much better than his heterosexual relationship with his wife, which exiles him from his own humanity and banishes him from society, and he ends up being brought back into the world by his lord. So I was working on this essay, and I was like, someone should write this as a queer fantasy novel, that would be great. And this would be back in like 2016, I think this would have been. And then 3 years later, 2019, I was sitting there, I was in a bit of a gay yearning mood, really. And as happens sometimes, I decided, this is a very good time to write that werewolf novel that I've been thinking about. And once I started writing it, I realised about halfway through the first draft that I was actually writing about disability much more than I was writing about yearning. Well, I was writing about yearning, but it was so much about bodies and so much about having that complex, difficult relationship with your own body, and having these conditions that overcome you periodically and exile you from yourself, and having struggled a lot with chronic pain and chronic illness, and especially with recurring flare-ups that would take from me parts of my identity and things that were really important to me, I suddenly realised, the werewolf is a great metaphor for that. So once I realised I was doing that, I started doing it on purpose, because I never plan these things. That's sort of where it started.
Yeah, because it seems to me that one of the things that comes across really clearly in your book is precisely that this interest in embodiment and what happens when your body doesn't obey the rules that bodies are supposed to obey. and doesn't kind of turn up in the categories that make it make sense. And it seems to me that there's a kind of really interesting kind of overlap there between discussion of pain and disability, but also a discussion of queerness as well.
Yeah, I think so much of it is about, you know, existing as someone who doesn't have a doesn't have a normative body mind, doesn't slip neatly into place in a cis-heteronormative capitalist hellscape. And especially, like, I see a lot of overlap between ableism and transphobia, for example. So much of that is rooted in this sort of fetishization of the unmodified, unmedicated, unsupported body that can somehow just exist independently, even though actually every single person in this world is dependent on each other. We all need things, and I see so much of it as like, sometimes you need support, and it seems like society would rather punish people for needing support than actually give it to them. And that goes whether you're trans or disabled or just broke that week, or, you know, there's so many factors. And then once you start bringing in like mental health and, you know, like mad liberation and stuff like that, the idea of, you know, werewolfism has often been characterised as mental illness in the past, like lycanthropy as a mental condition. And I think that overlaps also with queerness getting categorised as a mental condition, and this kind of, I guess, pathologization of the variety of human nature and of the different ways that one can exist in the world. They all are they're interconnected struggles, and there needs to be solidarity between the struggles as well, I think.
And I think what your book does is talks about the flip side of that, which is about authenticity and being seen for who you are. And I thought that came across very clearly for me in the way in which the hero is contrasting his relationship with his wife and with the king, that you know, kind of one of them sees him as a man and one of them sees him for who he is.
Yeah, very much. There was a phrase that kind of got memed on the internet a few years back, which was, if we want the rewards of being loved, we have to submit to the mortifying ordeal of being known. And I think that was the phrase that I was bearing in mind the whole way through writing this book. It is about the mortifying ordeal of being known. Sometimes that is absolutely terrifying, to be stripped bare like that. But unless you can be vulnerable with someone, you can't be loved by them because they don't know who you are, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk a bit more about how you travel back in time to the Middle Ages and how you created this world for us. It must have taken a lot of research, a lot of thought because it's a very textured, vivid evocation of a medieval court and medieval spaces which precisely are outside of the court, like the forest. So can you tell us a bit about how you went about that and how you created that world?
Yeah, it's really great actually writing novels while being a PhD student, or like some of the time while I was editing this, I was working as a library assistant in the philosophy library, because it meant I had access to all the university libraries, which makes researching novels a lot easier. I would just like show up at the UL and leave with a massive stack of books about like castles and hunting and stuff like that, and they'd be like, "Oh, what are you writing about?" I was like, "I'm going to get a good grade in library books sometime." Every time they complimented me on my selection, I was like, even I went to the map room and looked at maps of Brittany and stuff like that to try and work out, you know, where it could be located, how it would interact with the landscape. I always forget that hills exist.
But we're living in Cambridge.
Exactly. So like my first 3 novels are set in a fictional city, but it's in Yorkshire. And I kind of forgot there's hills in Yorkshire. And so for the first 2 books of that trilogy, I don't think it mentions hills once. And then like just before I was like working on the 3rd book and we went to visit the area where the city would be, and I was like, oh, okay, I need to add some topography. So I decided with this one not to make that mistake. I was like, I'm going to the map room, I'm going to look at the contour lines. And I also spent a lot of time like trying to make sure the plants and everything were native, be like, do they have bluebells? I need to find out if they have bluebells. So I did a lot of like book-centered research, I guess, like that. I realised in the early drafts my impression of castles and of hunting and everything was very much derived from pop culture.
Yeah.
You know, I realised the sort of default castle in my head is the one from BBC Merlin. which is the wrong era for this book. That's a very late castle. And obviously most castles that are around now have been added to and expanded over time, so it's really hard to actually get an impression of what a 12th century castle would be like. And I watched a lot of videos of like people going around castle ruins and like talking about how they were structured, and I found out they didn't have corridors, so I had to take all the corridors out of the book. And I was like, well, we can get some clues from the poem itself about how the castle must be structured. Because, for example, in many castles, the main hall was actually on an upper level and it was accessed by quite a narrow staircase. I was like, well, it can't be that, because there's no mention of how they get the wolves up and down the stairs. So
I never thought of that. Maybe like Starlit.
Yeah, so it must be a ground floor hall, otherwise that wolf is having difficulties. So, you know, architecture in the literature. So like having a hall with maybe a chamber on either side. We know the king has his own chamber, so okay, that's an architectural clue. And probably the kitchens would have been outside at this point. One thing that really surprised me to learn in all my castle research is that everyone who worked in a castle at that point would have been male. Like all the servants within the castle itself would have been men. Often, in fact, they would be like the sons of nobles who would serve in their youth. So it was not even necessarily like a separate social caste, but more a transitional stage in life would be to be in service. And there would be women doing some of the work, especially like laundry and things like that, but that would be taking place outside the castle proper. So it creates this very masculine environment where you don't really even have background female characters. And some people don't like that, but I do think it is kind of essential to creating that slightly claustrophobic homosocial environment in the book, and also isolating Bisclavret's wife in a way that makes her actions make more sense. You know, she is in this position as like she's the one woman. And when you start to see her like that, you're like, oh, okay. This maybe explains why she feels a little bit threatened by finding out her husband's a werewolf, because like, who's she going to go to for help about that? Who are they going to believe? It's a boys' club. So yeah, there was like practical things like that. Another thing I spent a lot of time researching was clothing. And this is where the books failed me, because they were just describing clothing for pages on end, and I was like, I don't know what this is. So then I turned to the reenactors, and I found people making YouTube videos that are like, get ready with me, 12th century edition. And I was like, great, this is what I need. And so they were explaining how the different layers of clothing work. And I found this so fascinating, because it illuminated so much about medieval literature. Like they were talking about how for the really high status clothing where they have the tightly fitted sleeves, now they don't have the button sleeves yet. What they would do was sew the sleeves every time they were worn. So your clothing requires somebody else to put it on you, which is a really interesting way of thinking about, for a character who his clothing is the mechanism through which he takes human form and is accepted as human, to have that be something that somebody else has to stitch you into is a very interesting commentary on the nature of human belonging. But also that made several scenes in other medieval romances make sense to me. Like, I was rereading some Chrétien, and there was a scene where, I think it was in Event or something, and it's like, oh, and then she sewed his shirt, and I was like, did he rip it? Like, I didn't know what this meant, and you know, he never explains it in the text, because he thinks, well, they would know what that meant. And after I found out about like the sewing sleeves, I was like, oh, I get it now. So there was a lot of things like that I layered in, and the more I knew about the history, the more I could see in the literature itself that I could then put back into the literature. They really fed into each other.
So that explains why that's the first question that his wife asks,
yeah.
right? Because that's always struck me, and like you know, you were saying that as well, and you know, when you were performing that as well, you know, you're kind of like, okay, what is going on? Where do you go for half the week? And then he says, oh, well, I'm a werewolf. And the first thing she says is, well, what do you do with your clothes? And it's always struck me a bit like, you know, kind of what people say to astronauts about, well, where do you go to the loo?
I think it is a little bit, because she's thinking, okay, well, who have you trusted with this? Who is helping you after this? Like, who have you given this information to? Or alternatively, well, have you completely abandoned your high status and are dressing like a peasant? So there's like two possibilities, is either he's brought someone else into his confidences to help him dress, or he has completely abandoned his identity as a baron. But either way, that like she's like, okay, well, you know, what's going on here? This is a kind of crisis of identity. I mean, it is a good question also when you look at some of those clothing, like how would you get in and out of that, especially like in armour. Like getting in and out of chainmail, man. They like, you can't just burst out of it like a werewolf in a BBC show. So, you know, Being Human was a big influence on me growing up.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about the wife, because there are lots of different readings of this.
Yeah.
And that's why it's such a great story, right? And a lot of feminist readings precisely see it as the wife's story, and it can be read as a story of control and victim blaming, and I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about, you know, kind of the way that your book precisely treats this story, but because, you know, there is, in a crucial moment of it, a very graphic piece of violence.
Yeah.
And I wondered how you'd approach that.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, because, like, I mean, you could tell this whole story from the wife's point of view, and I mean, it could be, for example, a narrative of domestic violence.
Yeah.
She finds out her husband is this supposedly violent creature. She tries to maneuver him and escape, and ultimately she is proved right, because that's the thing, like, she bases her assumption that he is violent on stories she's heard about, well, whereas we've been told up to this point he's never done it. Like, we're kind of told, well, he's innocent up to that point, but then he proves her right by attacking her, so ultimately her position is actually validated, and we do have this problem of, well, what else could she have done? If she is afraid for herself, like, who could she go to for help? Her husband is the king's favourite. She can't go to the king and say, well, your baron's a werewolf, actually, because they're buddy-buddy, and she's going to be the one who gets the blame. And that is a really difficult tension, and I think this is a tension you grapple with any kind of queer retellings of text when you start foregrounding those male-male relationships as well. Often the female characters do get sidelined. And I didn't want to do that, but I think it's a little bit difficult to completely avoid it, so I wouldn't claim that I've completely avoided it. I think all you can do to some extent is handle that sidelining with sympathy and with certain, like, acknowledgement. Actually, there is something valid in her fear. Like, I don't think she necessarily does the right thing, but I also don't think there is a right thing for her to do in this situation. And I think, like, one of the changes I made in my version that's not in the original is I gave his wife a connection with the king. So she's the king's ward at the start of the book. So this allows for a lot of kind of doubling and, like, displacement of desire and, like, complicated feelings where he's kind of projecting his feelings about the king onto his wife and so on.
It's a lot of complicated feelings.
But that also puts her in this really difficult position, because the reason she's a ward of the king is that, you know, she's orphaned her. She doesn't really have any family. She's, like, part of this household. And so once she marries Bisclavret, like, she's cut off from her only other sources of support. And it's like, well, yeah, who does she turn to when the whole world she's immersed in is actually Bisclavret's world now? And very much contributes to that suggestion that she is incredibly isolated and, like, doesn't really have that many people to turn to in this situation, I think. And I do think you could do a lot more with her as a character, probably. Like, she could have her own story. The other difference I made was that the knight that she marries, in my version, is Bisclavret's cousin, who is the only person who has known a werewolf since they were children together, to kind of intensify that betrayal. But that also means that, you know, her whole world is also connected to his world. Nobody's ever really getting out of this loop. Which I'm now talking about it, I'm like, that's also the theme of my next book. I don't know to make that clear. I just keep writing about people trapped in, like, one family when no one outside it to help them.
But it's the king's story and the wolf story.
Yeah.
And the way that you do that in this novel, I think, is really brilliant, because you have three very different voices. So when we're reading from the wolf's point of view, it's in the third person, it's he. And when we're reading from the king's point of view, it's in the second person and it's you, which kind of does something to the reader and kind of puts us in the position of this very kind of haunted ruler. And when it's the wolf, it's this kind of gorgeous, fragmentary, flickering free verse. And that's very, you don't do that by accident. So
No.
tell us about that decision.
So Bisclavret the man is the most conventional with the third person. I think I had to write him in third person. I couldn't have written him in first, for example, because I think, especially when he's in human form, he's very much keeping himself at arm's length from everything, including from himself. So you couldn't let him collapse into first. I don't think he really has a first person narrative at that point. He's so bottled up in himself and keeping himself at a distance. And that, I mean, I think you can do third person very intimately, but I also deliberately chose it to be just that tiny step further back. And Bisclavret is the only character in the book who has a name, because he's the only character in the lake who has a name, and I didn't want to create names for it. So that meant he was also the easiest to write in third person. Because if I wrote all of them in third person and no one has a name, I would be lost in the he-hims. I mean, there are practical concerns here. So then the king being in second person, I think second person is the most misunderstood perspective, because everyone thinks that it's only used for, like, read it, insert fan fiction. Everyone thinks that you is them, you know, it's the reader, it's the audience, I'm talking to you, and they're like, well, I didn't do that. Although I have also heard people say this about first person, and I'm like, I need you to understand the concept of a character. But the thing I like to think of with second person is it's more that, like, you're listening in on a story being told to someone else.
Right.
So someone's telling the story to the king, and you're like, hello. And I think it has a sort of simultaneous intimacy and distance to it, because you're, like, right in there, you can't hide. Like, a second person character, like, they cannot hide because we're looking right at them. Whereas a first person narrator can lie to you.
Yeah.
A first person narrator can elude things, they can reframe things, they can just straight up lie. And a second person character doesn't have control over the narrative in the same way. They're much more, like, subject to how they're being perceived, I guess, by this unnamed narrator. And a king is a very fundamentally dependent position. You can't be a king by yourself. A king exists because they have subjects. A king exists in the eyes of others. A king only exists in second person, essentially. And it strips from him a level of his personal identity and sort of autonomy to exist outside of that identity of king. When you're a king, you are always the person being looked at. So that's where the second person really shines. But also, it means that I didn't have to name him. It can just be you. And then the verse for the wolf. So I actually originally wrote these as a stream of consciousness in first person, because that's where the boundaries that Bisclavret is keeping with himself has collapsed, so we can have that first person narration. And it was originally just like all stream of consciousness, no punctuation, but prose. But that wasn't working, and I wanted it to feel more alien, more different from the human perspectives, to have more kind of sensory stuff, but kind of more abstract sense. So he's very attuned to the environment around him, the world around him, but at the same time, sometimes that makes things make less sense, not more. And poetry really shines for that, because it sort of abstracts the emotions and the experiences through this lens of incomprehension, or through this lens of poetry. And I'd originally done it as a sort of dialogue, so I had still the first person perspective of Bisclavret the man kind of coming through, and then this unidentified narrator was one voice, and then we had the instincts of the wolf down the middle, and it kind of had this Greek chorus echo vibe to it. But that just seemed really complicated, not least from a formatting perspective. So in the end, I collapsed the two sides of the dialogue together, but you can still feel that push and pull is still there a little bit. And we have the first person coming through in italics, and then the narration. I mean, who is narrating the prose? That is the question. Is it the same person? Is it the same person who's narrating the use of the king? I don't know. And we still have the wolf's instincts coming through, and they come through stronger and stronger the longer he spends in wolf form. And I know that, like, quite often I bounce off things that are written in verse or free verse, because it just feels like prose with line breaks. Can't stand that. So I knew I didn't want to do that, but also I couldn't write it in, like, rhyming couplets like the original, because you do that in modern English, it just sounds really twee. So I knew I couldn't do that, but I wanted it to have some kind of, like, genuine poetry there. So there's, like, a lot of alliteration, a lot of, like, focus on the rhythm. I read the whole book aloud over and over again. And also the wolf and Bisclavret the man and the king, I worked really hard to eliminate anachronistic similes. At one point, I read an entire book about medieval science, and then I went to the Whipple Museum to look at astrolabes just to fix one simile to better represent a 12th century view of astronomy, because I realised, hang on, that doesn't work. And I spent so much time with the historical thesaurus being like, oh, they can't say that because that concept is mechanical and it's 18th century, right, okay. Like just hours and hours, whereas with the wolf there's a few more deliberately like anachronistic technical academic language slipping through to create this idea that the wolf is outside of human time and outside of the society that the other characters are living in. So people will probably think it's an accident, and I just let that one slip through. I'm like, no, I did that one on purpose.
It's time though. But there are some lovely descriptions of medieval writing practice in this novel. And I have a particular question which is about the scribe.
Yes.
So, because we have all these characters in the castle, and one of them, there are several who have these kind of very intimate relationships with the king, and you know he's their confidant and he's their lover and
the scribe
lots
with
of
benefits.
things. But the scribe. And he's, you know, he kind of turns up and he's got all, and he's such an interesting character, and he and the king have this, you know, kind of, scribe with benefits relationship, and then he just disappears.
He does.
What has happened? Where did he go? What has gone on? And he leaves the king with a book of lead.
Yeah.
So one of my questions when I was reading this is the scribe married to pass? After all.
Yeah, which is my most fascinating theory that anyone's given me. Actually, I love it. Every single person, like beta reader who read this book, was like, okay, what's going on with this guy? Like, one of my friends was like, he gives off weird immortal vibes. Like maybe he spent a bunch of time as a fish, and I was like, okay.
I did not get it. Right?
I was like, well, he didn't spend any time as a fish. The weird immortal vibes, on the other hand, might be more accurate. So he's not married to France. No. He's not married to France. I think his book of for those who haven't read the book yet, the scribe is someone that the king befriended while he was in exile, while he was still prince. And he brings him back when he returns from exile. So he's like his one person in the castle that kind of is outside of his very complicated relationships as a new king. Like they already have an established connection. And he's from overseas. He's from overseas.
Where?
He is Irish,
so many questions.
actually.
Okay.
There are a few clues in the reference. So you were mentioning the descriptions of his of scribal practice. There's a lot of like ruling parchment and so on. So there's actually 3 reasons probably that there's so much attention on parchment in this book. The first is actually relates to something you said in a lecture once. You were talking about the fact that parchment is animal skin, and that to exist in a manuscript is a form of being embodied. Which I was just like, yeah. And this book is so much about stories in bodies. And so I was like, oh, I can do like a little pretentious thing where I can constantly refer to them, writing stories on bodies, and they can be part of my imagery. The second is that I was revising for a paleography and codicology exam in November 2020 when I was doing my master's in Cork, and for that exam we had to explain the steps of making parchment, all the way from like removing the hair from the skin all the way through to ruling it to write. So every step you had to memorize it, and then we also had to do how to make ink from oak gall to ink and everything. So I was having to learn all these steps, and I was like, while I was revising them, I was thinking about this scribe that I had in this book, and I was like, oh, that was inaccurate, okay. So I got a little bit distracted and went back to rewrite those scenes, then got carried away, rewrote the whole book. And that's when I sent it to my agent, was after I did that. So it was partly me just going, oh, I've learned a lot about parchment, I want to put that in the book. And the third thing is that I got really sick, and I know this is a pet peeve that several of my friends share, of fantasy novels treating the word parchment as if it's just an old-timey word for paper. Where characters will rip a piece of parchment, they will crumple a piece of parchment, they will write one line on a whole sheet of parchment and throw it away, and I was like, that's a sheep! That costs money, you can't just like throw away a sheep because you wrote a shopping list on it. What do you do? Come on, get your wax tablets out. So I have a lot of opinions about like historical surfaces, writing surfaces in novels, and I was like, I've got to redress the balance, I've got to have people complaining about the holes in the parchment. But yeah, there are a few clues in descriptions of the scribe's paleography to the fact that he's Irish, which no one's going to pick up on. I mean, he's from Donegal originally. And he is actually a character from another project of mine that I was like, well, I think he was in France around then, and it kind of makes sense that he would be here, and I need a scribe, so I'll just borrow that character, because the advantage of no one in this book having names is I can do that and no one will know until they ask me about it. And so he is actually immortal, for the record. He doesn't know that yet. He spent a bunch of time in the other world, so he's a bit weird. And he's like, yeah, I'll probably die at some point. Well, the next time we see him is in the 17th century, so yeah, that didn't go too well.
But that's a very medieval practice, right? Of that, you know, of characters turning up elsewhere, you know.
And the idea of a character who just wanders in is significant for one and wanders out again. Like, you pick up any Arthurian text and you're like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
Where is he? They were here for 5 minutes and now they're gone again and they have all this backstory and I don't know who they are. Yeah, exactly. I wanted to bring in that idea of like
interlace.
And there are a lot of characters in this book also who are, or there's a lot of details that are drawing on other medieval literatures. I mean, there's like metaphors I nicked straight from Chrétien. Like there's one description of knights that's from Perceval. There's one bit of sexy heresy that I took straight from Chevalier de Charette. There's
Jack. I didn't know. Just to say.
There's a reference to Yonec. There's a reference to Eliduc. There's a reference to Lanval. There's a reference.
All of these are lanes, but this has all got very, very nerdy.
There's a reference.
Yeah,
there's a passing reference to Reynard the fox and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So a lot of it was me borrowing things, and some of it is also like. So there's one knight who we get referred to as the Knight in Green.
He's great.
He is great. I like him. And he's not a specific person. Like, he doesn't necessarily have a name in my head. However, the role that he fulfills in this novel is very similar to the role that Gawain fills in a different medieval werewolf tale, Melion, which has a very similar plot to Bisclavret, but is in an explicitly Arthurian setting. Now, since my book is not in an Arthurian setting and my king is not Arthur, the Knight in Green is not Gawain, but the role he fulfills is Gawain's role in Melion. So there's things like that where I'm like just borrowing characters and using them to like add some depth and detail. I forgot what the question was, sorry. I think... So we're talking about parchment. Oh, yeah.
We're talking about parchment, and also it occurs to me that, you know, another way of thinking about parchment in this is to think about skin and think about nakedness, which it seems to me is such an important, you know, because obviously the flip side of having to be sewn in and out of your clothes is what the significance of nakedness is. Oh, wow.
That was so vigorous in my arguments that my blood's cleaned
You're
off.
bursting out of your clothes.
Sorry, I'm going to turn into a werewolf.
But yeah, I mean, that's also about skin, isn't it? And it's also about, nakedness.
That was a very well-timed button popping. And like, you do, but like when I've looked at manuscripts in reading rooms and so on, the physicality of the parchment really does strike you. Especially my favourite thing is when there's been a rip during the preparation process and they have sewn it up and then it has kind of slightly healed and you can really see that it's skin. It's not just like this is thick, like you can see they've stitched like you would stitch an injury, which I find so fascinating. And I know that like not everyone has the chance to go to manuscript reading rooms and look at parchment for real, but if you ever want to get like a vague sense of what parchment is like, if you know any Buran players, the Irish drum, and you do because I play the Buran, the skin of that is made of goat skin, and it is essentially like one preparation stage less than parchment that you would use for writing. Like when I went to the Fitzwilliam Museum and handled parchment in different stages of preparation, the one before the one that's ready for writing, it's like a Buran skin. And I hit that with a stick for hours every week, and it hasn't broken yet. So that gives you a sense of how tough these narratives, like these narratives are inscribed on skin, and you can whack it with a stick. I mean, I don't recommend whacking manuscripts with sticks.
You won't be allowed back in the library.
Yeah, please don't hit the manuscripts. The ink is delicate, even though the parchment isn't.
Can we go back to some of the characters?
Yeah.
Another character that I really enjoyed was the priest.
Yes.
and he and Bisclavret have a very beautiful conversation, I thought, about suffering and grief.
Mm-hmm.
And he seems to be it seems to be coming from a very sort of personal, felt place for him. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about where, kind of where that comes from, and where the treatment of kind of illness and suffering comes from.
Yeah, so one thing I find in a lot of kind of pseudo-medieval fantasy is they will just completely cut out the Christianity and not really put anything in to fill the gap, and I think the foundations sort of fall down of a lot of medieval Europe if you take the Christianity out, because it was kind of load-bearing. So I knew that...
It's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah. So it's like, however you feel about it, it's very much in the structure. But I wanted it to be part of the character's world. I wanted it to be part of the structure and the politics and the economics and the education of their world, as well as personal faith, because it's not just about what they believe, it's also just, how the world around them functions. But I did want it to be like, often it just gets portrayed as like a wholly negative thing, or like a very repressive situation, and I wanted it to be a bit more positive a portrayal. Like, I don't share these characters' faith, and in fact I had to have what I call my heresy reader, what my editor amusingly refers to as an authenticity reader. I was like, oh yeah, we've got to make sure we correctly represent the 12th century chaplains, so that, marginalised group and all that. So my friend Eleanor helpfully read over the book a few times to check for accidental Protestantism, because I grew up in the Baptist church, so it's about as far from 12th century Christianity as you can get. These days I'm an atheist Quaker, which is even further. And gave me some sexy little antiphons, in her words, to make the prayers accurate for the period, and spent a lot of time dealing with getting the right translation of the Bible to use and so on. But I wanted the chaplain to be quite a sympathetic figure. Yeah. And the first conversation he has with Bisclavret sort of speaks in veiled terms about being a werewolf. He's like, I have a condition, and the chaplain interprets that as he has a health condition, and he talks about it, and he draws a direct parallel with his own chronic pain and the doubt and difficulty that he's experienced from having chronic pain. Because for me, that was a fundamental turning point in my relationship with faith, was when I became disabled. But it was a chance for me to be like, okay, well, if you haven't spotted that the werewolf is a disability metaphor yet, I'm just going to sit here and make it a little bit more obvious for you. So it's a little bit that. But I wanted that relationship with faith to not be, I guess, not fix everything and not ruin everything. It's there through the pain. And it doesn't have all the answers, but it also doesn't make everything worse. I don't know. I slightly lost my train of thought. And I wanted Bisclavret to have someone to talk to about his condition, who would sort of understand that when you fundamentally don't have control over your body, and when you can't predict what your body is going to take from you next, there is a great deal of anxiety in that. There is also a great deal of grief. Grieving all the people that you can't be because of it, all the things you've missed out on because of it. And also that terror of, what else am I going to lose? What else is it going to take from me? Particularly when you've already lost large parts of your identity to it. You're like, well, what's next? And so there wasn't any other werewolves for him to talk to. That's one of the things, is this book is so much about loneliness, and he's the only one. There is no one else who will get it. So this is, again, it's a solidarity thing. It's like, well, the struggles are not the same, but they overlap. They have that same core of, I want control over my own body, I don't have it, I will actually never have it, I need to find a way to make peace with that and to live with that.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if we were going to take some questions from anyone else, because I've still got loads, but...
And we only have about 40 minutes.
We only have about 40 minutes, but there's somebody at the back.
Good evening, thank you very much for being here. The first thing is, I'm looking forward to reading your book from the wife's perspective. It calls Being Married to a Werewolf, so that would be a one. And no, the other one was, because here you're dealing with a werewolf, and not, for example, with a werebear, with a werefox. So I was just curious, and looking forward to reading that in the book. if you took anything in particular or had a certain approach for it dealing with being a wolf specifically, or that part of saying, okay, so this is more instinctive, more connected to nature, or how was your approach on the wolf-human side of the same character?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, one thing I was really focused on, because they have these very different narrative styles, and I was thinking a lot about like how a wolf would experience the world on a sensory level. Because one of the crucial things about Bisclavret is that we're told he still has the mind of a man, the sense of a man. So to some extent, he is still going to experience the world as a human, but also through the wolf body. So you're not quite in a full wolf mindset, but you also have those wolf senses shaping the man's mindset. And so I was thinking about, well, how would he perceive sense, and how would he understand time passing through, like how the seasons change or how the plants change. Big focus on kind of smells and loss of colours and so on. And like wolves obviously have been very demonised historically, and I mean still are, to be honest. I think they're like still talking about, you know, hunting wolves because they killed someone's horse or something. So you have to like think a little bit about, what is the relationship that the people have with the wolves? You know, he's the only wolf in the forest because they have chased all of the rest of them out. So there's that really strong sense of threat that there wouldn't necessarily be for another animal that is less considered to be this predator, this enemy. You know, automatically being a wolf makes you an enemy, whereas if you turned into a frog or something, people probably aren't going to be that bothered. I mean, they might squash you by mistake.
They might kiss you.
Yeah, exactly. So it is something where being a wolf automatically puts him in this category of enemy, which is, specific to that animal because of how it is kind of culturally perceived.
But in the lay, now he never says he's wolf.
I know. This is just says he's a beast. He could have been anything. Maybe he was a chihuahua.
With feminine right, so says the best though.
Yeah. No, this is one of those things. And there's actually a few cases of this in medieval literature where we have just assumed we know what animal is being discussed. So like that could have actually been anything. Like we assume he's a wolf because of the comparison being made to werewolves up in Normandy they have these. But I want to tell you about the Bisclavret. Okay, different thing. We sort of assume he's a wolf, but actually, maybe he's not.
Any other questions? Oh, hello at the back.
I was just wondering, how do you kind of mitigate against a more kind of romanticised view of the hegemonic feudal system when we're foregrounding a homosocial relationship that is still between lord and master at the end of the day?
Yeah, it's really tricky because I fundamentally don't approve of monarchies. So writing a book where you have a king and he's supposed to be a desirable figure is very conflicting for me. A part of that, I think, sometimes it's not that you kind of have to suspend disbelief about that, but it's that it's like leaning into things like the king fundamentally has flaws. Sometimes these flaws affect his ability to rule well. That's because it's a bad system if you rely on one guy. When he has flaws, so does his rule, you know? And so some of that is just letting him be imperfect and letting the relationship be imperfect. I think it helps that this book is a more kind of literary fantasy rather than like a romantasy where the relationship, obviously the relationship is very central, but it's also not fully hitting those romance beats or having to conform to that idealized situation. I mean, my PhD research is on friendship in late medieval texts, and I look a lot at hierarchical relationships and relationships that also sort of subvert hierarchies through affection. And I think a lot about power imbalances in those kinds of relationships. And I think a lot of it comes down to reciprocity. They each need something from each other. It's not you're in charge, so I give you everything. It's I give you everything and you give it back. It is a two-way relationship. It has to go both ways. Again, a king is a fundamentally dependent position, but it's not a one-way exchange of service. It's actually going both ways. It's humbling yourself to the other person. It's being needed in both directions, I think.
I think that comes across really strongly in the book. Yeah. One more question.
Can you tell us about the next two books, because and what they have in common with The Wolf and His King?
Yeah. So my next book is called The Animals We Became, and it is a retelling. It's more non-consensual shapeshifting. Everyone's having a bad time being an animal. It's a retelling of the fourth branch of the Mabinogi, which is a medieval Welsh text in which, everyone's having a bad time with gender and compulsory heterosexuality and getting turned into animals and having babies and stuff like that. It's a lot darker than this one, I think. It's a lot more focused on trauma and on a very toxic family trapped in an incestuous spiral. And it's not romantic. It's occasionally sexy, but it's not romantic, so it's quite different from this one. So yeah, there is sex in it, there isn't romance in it, which is always fun to explain to people. So it's a lot darker, but it still deals with some of the same things, so like autonomy and wanting control of your body and human nature and like how do you exist as a human who has been changed into something that's not a human and so on. And then the one after that, which I actually haven't written yet, so it's a little bit terrifying. So that one's called To Run with the Hound. We're on an animal theme here, which is, it's a retelling of some tales from the Ulster cycle, so medieval Irish. So that's my actual specialism. It's focusing on Cuchulainn and his close relationships with Ferdia and Loig and Eva. That one's very much more of a tragedy. It's kind of about being doomed by the narrative, but not in the way that you thought you were. But because I haven't written that one yet, it's a little bit hard to say too much about it. I would say this is probably my most romantic book and the one that has the kind of happiest ending. But yeah, the same kind of medieval retelling, weird stylistic choices. The next one's also partially in second person a little bit, but in a different style. It's two first-person narrators, but one of them is talking to the other, so addressing them as you. And also lying the whole way through. I love an unreliable narrator, and Gwydion is deeply unreliable in every way. So yeah, and that one's out next year, and the other one theoretically the year after, but also like I do have a PhD to finish. So. Yeah. My supervisor is here today. So yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to leave it there while we're looking to the future. But Finn, thank you again for this lovely book, and thanks for all those great questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.